On a cold November night in 2010, the streets of Salem, Oregon were wrapped in fog. A steady drizzle tapped against rooftops and the lamps along quiet blocks flickered faintly, their pale halos reflected in the wet pavement. It was the kind of night no one remembered, because nothing seemed unusual. Stores had closed, families were inside, and the only sounds were tires hissing on slick asphalt and the low hum of a freight train rolling north. Yet in that ordinary silence, a tragedy began, one that would stay hidden for more than a decade until a single overlooked clue exposed it. That evening, 19-year-old victim name Placeholder finished her shift at a grocery store on Lancaster Drive. Friends remembered the same things about her: the light brown jacket she wore almost every night, the scuffed backpack decorated with doodles, and the way she smiled even when exhausted. She was a sophomore at Chemiquetta Community College, studying environmental science and talking often about transferring to Oregon State to pursue forestry. At home, she was still the youngest daughter, still the one leaving sketches and handwritten notes on the fridge for her parents. She clocked out at 9:12 p.m., waved to her manager, and crossed the lot toward her silver compact car. Security footage showed her briefly. Hood pulled up against the rain. In a final text to a friend, she wrote, "Going to the park for a bit. Need to clear my head." Her favorite place was Wallace Marine Park, a stretch of riverbank where she said the water always listened. That night the river was waiting. She would never return. By morning, her absence was undeniable. She missed her first class. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By afternoon, when she hadn't appeared at home or answered messages, her parents drove to campus, checked the library, and called her friends. Each conversation ended with the same hollow answer: no one had seen her. By evening, dread hardened into fear. Her father drove her usual route twice before finally dialing Salem police. His voice cracked as he said the words no parent wants to speak. "My daughter didn't come home last night. Please help us." Officers responded quickly, headlights cutting through the drizzle. Less than 2 hours later, flashlights swept the Wallace Marine Park lot. In a corner sat her silver car. The driver's door was ajar, rain pooled on the seat. Her jacket lay on the backrest, her backpack on the passenger side, damp but untouched. Keys still hung in the ignition. It was as if she'd stepped out mid-thought and disappeared into the mist. The lot was silent except for the patter of rain. When beams crossed the ground, something caught an officer's eye. The soil was soft from the storm, and in the mud were overlapping shoe impressions, scattered, twisting, without direction. Not the calm tracks of someone walking, but the chaos of a struggle. Nearby, half hidden under wet leaves, was a scrap of fabric, dark, torn at the edge, with a faint blood smear clinging to the fibers. The air around the officers grew heavy. This was no longer just a missing person. Within hours, the park was cordoned with yellow tape. Squad cars lined the entrance, red and blue lights flashing against dripping trees. K-9 units searched the shoreline, handlers urging them through tall grass. One dog stopped and whined near the tide line, nose pressed to the ground. But the Willamette River was swollen with rain, its restless surface carrying away whatever traces the night had left. Divers entered the black water, their lights flickering beneath the surface, but found nothing. At 3 a.m., soaked and exhausted, the search was suspended. News spread by dawn. College student vanishes. Car found abandoned. The first headlines read. Salem residents whispered about the silver car, the blood-stained fabric, the missing girl. Parents clutched their children tighter. Classmates stared at the empty chair in the lecture halls. The town's illusion of safety fractured overnight. At the family's small home, grief set in fast. Her mother left the porch light on, refusing to let the night win, while her father paced the driveway, scanning the fog as if she might appear. Inside, a framed graduation photo sat on the kitchen counter, her smile suddenly unbearable to look at. When officers arrived to update them, their uniforms dripped with rain. One spoke gently, his radio crackling at his side. he had no answers, only questions. By that evening, volunteers printed flyers with her face. Missing. Last seen, November 12th. They taped them to gas pumps, bus stops, and storefront windows. A vigil was held near the park. Dozens stood in the drizzle with candles flickering, classmates sobbing into each other's shoulders, professors whispering prayers, neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief. But under the candlelight, one thought lingered among the crowd. Someone in Salem had taken a 19-year-old girl, and no one knew who. That night marked the beginning of one of Oregon's most haunting mysteries. A young student vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a car with the door open, a scrap of blood-stained fabric, and footprints in the mud. For her family, it was the start of a nightmare that would stretch across years. For her community, it was the first taste of a truth they could never forget, that even in their quiet town, safety could disappear without warning. Before a community can understand the weight of a disappearance, it has to remember who was lost. In Salem, Oregon, people knew 19-year-old victim name placeholder as more than a headline. To classmates, she was the girl who always arrived early, notebook open, doodling trees in the margins. To neighbors, she was the polite young woman who watered their plants when they traveled. To her family, she was still the youngest, still the one who left handwritten notes on the fridge, went to class, back by 3. She had been born in 1991 at Salem Hospital, the second daughter of Daniel and Susan, placeholder. Daniel worked long hours as a mechanic, hands always marked with grease, while Susan served as a school librarian, her voice familiar to hundreds of children. Their life was modest, but their home radiated warmth. Even when money was tight, birthdays meant homemade cakes, and dinners meant sitting together at the table. Their daughter carried that same warmth forward. As a child, she crouched in the garden, asking endless questions about worms and roots. By high school, her curiosity had sharpened into purpose. Teachers remembered her reports on forest conservation and her insistence that Oregon's landscapes deserved protection. Her bedroom reflected it. Posters of mountain ranges hung beside Polaroids from family camping trips. On the desk sat paperback field guides and seashells collected from the coast. A bulletin board over her bed displayed a picture from Silver Falls, arms raised, smiling under a waterfall. Even after moving into a dorm, she told her mom she'd never change her old room. "It'll always be mine," she said one evening, boots muddy from a hike. At Chemiqueta Community College, she was focused on environmental science and dreamed of transferring to Oregon State. Friends teased her for talking about soil composition at parties, calling her a plant nerd. She only laughed. One classmate recalled, "She leaned over my notes once and said, 'You drew the wrong tree roots. They go deeper.' She wasn't mocking. She just wanted me to get it right. That was her." Professors remembered her not just for grades, but for energy. The student whose hand was always up, who cared more than most. To help pay tuition, she worked evening shifts at a grocery store. Customers remembered her small kindnesses. One woman later said, "She told me she liked my scarf. That tiny comment carried me through a hard week." These fragments of memory became precious once she vanished. Her older sister, Megan, kept every fridge note she found, admitting, "They were scraps of paper, but now they're all I have in her handwriting." Salem then was a town where neighbors waved, kids biked home at dusk, and doors were often left unlocked. Wallace Marine Park, by the Willamette River, was where she found calm. She often walked its trails alone, sketchbook in hand, listening to the water. Her disappearance struck at the heart of that familiarity. It wasn't just that someone was missing. It was her, the girl who smiled at strangers and scribbled trees in the margins of her notebooks. Her parents bore the weight hardest. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed staring at the bulletin board, as if willing her smile back from the photos. Susan clutched the backpack police returned from her abandoned car, holding it close to her chest. At night, she left the porch light burning, whispering prayers into the dark, while Daniel, drove her usual routes, scanning sidewalks as if she might reappear. The family's grief rippled outward. Neighbors delivered meals and filled their mailbox with prayer cards. Churches organized circles and newspapers printed her photo across front pages with the plea, "If you saw anything, call." But support carried a shadow. Parents warned children not to go out alone. Students stuck together after dark. What had been an ordinary town now felt uneasy, every stranger's glance heavier than before. A candlelight vigil was held 3 nights after her car was found. Hundreds gathered at the entrance to Wallace Marine Park, candles flickering against the mist. At the center stood her parents, Susan gripping a framed graduation photo, hands trembling, Daniel silent with jaw tight. Behind them, classmates held signs that read, "Bring her home." The silence between prayers was broken only by the river rushing past in the dark. For many, it was the moment they realized Salem had changed. The girl everyone knew from classrooms, checkout lines, and neighborhood sidewalks was gone. Her absence wasn't abstract. It was personal. Each flame at the vigil wasn't just for her, but for the recognition that their town's innocence had been broken. Yet beneath the grief, another current began to stir. People whispered that someone among them must have seen something, that someone knew more than they were saying. What Salem didn't yet realize was that those whispers of unease would soon harden into suspicion. The search for answers was only beginning, and every clue from that night would matter more than anyone yet understood. The night her silver car was found near Wallace Marine Park marked the shift from hope to dread. For officers on scene, the details spoke louder than words. The driver's door hung open, rain dripping onto the seat. Her jacket and backpack sat inside, untouched. The keys still dangled in the ignition. Friends would later point out that she hated leaving her car unlocked, let alone with the door ajar. That fact alone told police something was terribly wrong. The ground was soft from the rain. Flashlights skimmed the mud, catching a confusion of footprints stamped deep in the soil. They weren't neat walking tracks, but overlapping, jagged impressions, signs of a struggle. Under a layer of wet leaves, an officer lifted a scrap of fabric, torn at the edge, mud-caked and streaked faintly with blood. He sealed it in a paper bag without speaking. One detective muttered later, "From that moment, we knew. This wasn't someone who wandered off. This was a crime scene." By dawn, the park was sealed. Yellow tape stretched across the lot, squad cars idled with headlights casting beams into the fog, and K-9 units worked the shoreline. One dog stopped at the tide line and refused to move forward, whining against the pull of the current. Divers searched the Willamette's dark waters, their lights glowing faintly beneath the surface, but found nothing. It felt like the river itself was hiding something, one officer admitted. The story broke by morning. College student missing, car abandoned near river. Images of the silver car filled TV screens across Oregon. Reporters crowded the tape, microphones outstretched, while police confirmed only that evidence was being processed. But the backdrop, flashing lights and rain-slick pavement, said more than any statement. Volunteers joined within hours. Search parties combed trails and fields, taping her photo to bus stops and storefronts. Missing. Last seen November 12th. Candlelight vigils glowed at dusk, prayers whispered into the November mist. Yet, beneath the unity, suspicion began to stir. Neighbors asked each other who had seen her last, who might know something more. Detectives started close. Family, friends, co-workers, all were interviewed. One name surfaced again and again. Her ex-boyfriend, red herring suspect placeholder, a 21-year-old business student. The two had dated over a year before breaking up in the spring. Friends described recent arguments. A classmate recalled seeing them at a cafe, voices raised. "She told him she needed space," the classmate said. He looked furious. When investigators knocked, he answered nervously. He denied involvement, saying the relationship was over. His alibi was thin. He claimed he'd been home watching TV, but his roommate couldn't confirm the exact hours. Detectives noted his clipped tone and shifting posture. He was cooperative, but tension hung over every word. The public seized on his name. Rumors spread across campus and into grocery lines. Some were convinced jealousy had driven him. Others swore he wasn't capable. Her parents, caught in the storm, felt their trust fracture. They had once welcomed him into their home. To imagine him responsible cut deep. Evidence from the scene was rushed to the lab. Technicians swabbed the torn fabric for DNA. Weeks later, the results arrived. The profile did not match the ex-boyfriend. He was excluded. The blood belonged to someone else. The shift was immediate. Detectives who had built their case around him found themselves at a dead end. One investigator admitted, "It felt like chasing smoke. The one person everyone pointed to wasn't it." Public opinion turned. Neighbors accused police of ruining a young man's life. Students protested on campus, divided between blaming him and defending him. Under pressure, he withdrew from school, saying later he couldn't endure the whispers. For her parents, the exclusion brought no comfort. If not him, then who? Her mother clutched a flyer during a TV interview, voice breaking. "Someone knows. Please, just bring her home." Her father drove the same roads night after night, headlights sweeping empty sidewalks. Neither slept. Meanwhile, Salem's fear grew. Parents tightened curfews, neighbors locked doors, joggers abandoned. The park. Every stranger felt suspicious. For weeks, the silver car, the footprints, and the blood-stained fabric dominated headlines. Yet beyond those fragments, nothing new emerged. By Christmas 2010, the case was stalling. Police had an abandoned car, scattered prints, a torn scrap of clothing, and DNA that didn't belong to the only man they'd suspected. The flurry of attention faded. News crews moved on. The community returned to routines, but uneasily, with the knowledge that someone had taken a 19-year-old girl and was still out there. The unanswered questions lingered. What happened in the rain that night? Who dragged her from her car and left those chaotic prints in the mud? And why had the trail gone silent so quickly? Salem would live under those questions for years, and her parents would carry them into every sleepless night, waiting for a truth that seemed buried forever. By early 2011, the search for answers had slowed. The flyers with her face, once taped fresh each week, curled and peeled in the Oregon rain. The ink bled until only ghostly outlines stared back from lampposts and bus stops. At first, volunteers replaced them quickly, but as weeks turned into months, the replacements came less often. People wanted to help, but life moved on. For her parents, that reality cut like a second wound. The world kept turning, but theirs had stopped. Detectives chased every lead they could. They re-interviewed classmates, tracked anonymous tips, reviewed grainy security footage from nearby shops. Each promising thread unraveled. The DNA from the torn fabric went into CODIS, but no match surfaced. In 2010, technology wasn't advanced enough for more. "We had a piece of someone," one investigator admitted later, "but no name to attach it to." Her parents turned grief into ritual. Each night, her mother left the porch light burning. Her father drove past Wallace Marine Park, slowing near the lot where her car had been found. Sometimes he parked and sat in silence, headlights off, staring at the place where her life had collided with violence. "I thought if I stayed long enough," he said years later, "maybe I'd see something the police had missed." The strain wore them down. Her sister Megan found her mother sitting in the victim's room on weekends, clutching a sweater that still held a trace of her scent. Her father grew quieter, his laughter gone. Neighbors tried to help with food and cards, but even kindness became painful. Every gesture underscored the absence. By the summer of 2011, media attention had waned. Other stories pushed their way onto front pages. The anniversary of her disappearance sparked a vigil and a brief article, but coverage faded within days. At the second anniversary, 50 people stood in drizzle by the park. By the fifth, fewer than 20. Still, her parents came each year, candles in hand. They would not let her name vanish with the weather. In October 2011, Salem police called them in. A detective spoke carefully. The investigation had exhausted all leads. With no new evidence and no DNA match, the case was being reclassified. Cold case. Her father clenched his fists on the table. Her mother whispered, "No, no, it can't be." But the word went into the file anyway, stamped in red. For the family, the label felt like another death. Her room remained untouched, bed neatly made, Polaroids still on the wall. On her birthday, her father baked her favorite cake and set a candle at the table as if she might walk through the door. Her mother joined support groups for families of the missing, repeating the same promise. "As long as I live, I'll fight for her." The town carried the silence differently. Parents used the case as a warning for their daughters. Professors told new students she had once sat in their classes. But beyond the whispers, a deeper unease lingered. "It was like she vanished twice," one neighbor said, once that night, and again when people stopped talking about her. Others wondered quietly if someone in Salem still knew more than they admitted. By 2015, her name surfaced only in small anniversary pieces. Reporters urged tips to the hotline, but nothing useful came. To most, she had become a cautionary tale. To her parents, she was still the center of every sleepless night. They wrote letters to state officials, begged the FBI for help, and filled binders with articles and notes. Each rejection carried the same words: no new evidence, no way forward. The years blurred, each season folding into the next. Holidays were marked by an empty chair, birthdays by an unlit smile. The word "cold case" haunted their home. It wasn't just a bureaucratic label, it was a sentence, but they refused to accept it as final. "Somewhere out there," her father said in a 2018 interview, voice trembling but firm, "is the person who knows what happened, and one day we'll find them." For Salem, the case became part of its identity. Parents told the story to their children, professors repeated it to new students, and the park where her car had been found grew into a place of unease. Still, the truth remained buried. What no one realized then was that the evidence sitting in a storage locker, a torn scrap of fabric and the DNA it carried, already held the key. The world just wasn't ready to unlock it. But when technology finally caught up more than a decade later, Salem would have to face the truth that had been waiting all along. For nearly 13 years, her case sat in the cold case files, a binder on a shelf collecting dust. Detectives retired, officers transferred, and the family aged under the weight of waiting. The evidence, the torn scrap of fabric, the chaotic shoe prints in the mud, the DNA with no name, sat boxed and silent. To her parents, it was like their daughter's story had been locked away with it. But in early 2023, Oregon announced it was joining a new program. Genetic genealogy, already making headlines in other states, was now being expanded statewide. It was the same tool that had unmasked notorious cases elsewhere, tracing suspects not through direct DNA matches in CODIS, but by building family trees from partial matches in public databases. For most people, it was just another story on the evening news. For her parents, it was a lifeline. After more than a decade of darkness, there was finally a chance that the DNA from that night could speak. The sample was shipped to a specialized lab. What had once been too degraded for CODIS was now sequenced in near full detail. Analysts built a profile, piece by piece, until they had something that could be uploaded to genealogy databases. Days later, a hit appeared. It wasn't the suspect himself, but a distant cousin, a name connected to a sprawling family tree that stretched across Oregon and into neighboring states. Forensic genealogists began the meticulous work. They traced marriages, cross-referenced census data, combed through public records. Each branch of the tree eliminated more names until they narrowed to a handful of men who could have lived in Salem in 2010. One name stood out: Michael "Mike" Raines. Raines was 51, a former security guard who had lived just a few blocks from Wallace Marine Park back in 2010. At the time of the disappearance, he was 38, recently divorced, and working night shifts at a local warehouse. His name had been noted once in the original investigation as part of a neighborhood canvass, but he hadn't known the victim, had no major criminal record, and nothing tied him directly to the crime scene. He was quietly dismissed as one of dozens of men living nearby. Now, in 2023, the DNA trail pointed straight back to him. Detectives launched quiet surveillance. They learned Raines still lived in Oregon, renting a small house on the outskirts of Salem. He worked sporadic jobs, mostly odd security contracts, and kept to himself. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who never stayed long in conversation. He was the kind who nodded, waved, and walked away, one neighbor recalled. Investigators followed him for weeks. They watched his routines: grocery runs, gas station stops, late-night walks. They needed a discarded item to confirm the match. The chance came one afternoon when Raines tossed a fast food bag and soda cup into a public trash can outside a convenience store. Detectives retrieved it immediately, gloved and careful, and sent it to the lab. When the results came back, the tension that had lingered for 13 years broke. The DNA on the soda straw matched the profile from the blood-stained fabric. After more than a decade, the man who had vanished into Salem's background was suddenly at the center. For her parents, the call from detectives was almost too much to process. Her mother wept openly, saying she had prayed for this moment every night. Her father listened in silence, then whispered, "We have a name." The relief was real, but so was the weight, because knowing who had done it meant revisiting every detail of what they had lost. News of the breakthrough rippled through the community. Salem residents who had nearly forgotten the case suddenly found themselves talking about it again. The local paper ran the headline, "DNA Technology Revives 2010 Cold Case." On social media, old classmates posted her photo, saying her story was finally moving again after being frozen in time. But alongside relief was outrage. People asked why it had taken 13 years. Why hadn't this technology been applied sooner? Why had her family been forced to wait in silence? Detectives moved quickly. In July 2023, officers surrounded Raines' house in the early morning. Neighbors watched as he was led out in handcuffs, his face blank. He was booked on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping. For many in Salem, seeing his face on the news was surreal. He wasn't an outsider or a drifter. He had lived among them, shopped at the same stores, walked the same sidewalks. Some recalled seeing him at the original vigils, quietly standing at the edge of the crowd. The thought that the killer had stood beside grieving parents while pretending to mourn chilled the community to its core. For investigators, the arrest was vindication. "The DNA doesn't lie," one said at the press conference. "This was the breakthrough we needed." For the Monroe family, it was the end of a nightmare that had stretched across nearly half their lives. "We waited 13 years, her father told reporters, but today, we can finally say her name with justice attached to it. Yet, even as Salem exhaled, new questions surfaced. How had Raines slipped through the cracks in 2010? Why had his name been so easily dismissed back then? And what other cold cases were still waiting for technology to catch up? The answers would unfold in court. But for the first time in 13 years, Salem no longer lived under the shadow of an unanswered question. The evidence had finally spoken, and it pointed to a man who had lived in plain sight all along. When Michael Raines was brought into the Marion County Jail, the weight of 13 years pressed down on the interrogation room. He sat hunched at the metal table, hands cuffed, eyes fixed on the floor. At 51, his face had aged into deep lines, but there was still a hardness there, the kind of stare that avoided guilt by pretending not to feel. Detectives who had spent years staring at the cold case file now stared at the man who had lived inside it all along. At first, Raines said little. He asked for water, adjusted in his chair, and sat in silence. Detectives pressed gently at first, reminding him of his life in Salem in 2010, his walks by Wallace Marine Park, his job as a night guard. He denied any connection to the missing student. But when they showed him the lab report, the DNA match from the soda straw tied to the fabric found near her car, his posture shifted. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly as if the fight had drained from him. Hours passed, questions circling. Finally, in a flat voice, he began to talk. He said that night in November 2010, he had been drinking. He often walked the park after shifts, circling the lot and drifting toward the river. He noticed her silver car pull in, saw her step out with her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "She looked like she wanted to be alone," he said quietly, "but I didn't leave it alone." According to his statement, he called out to her, tried to strike up conversation. She ignored him, kept walking. When she shook her head and told him no, something in him snapped. "It made me angry," he admitted, eyes still lowered. "I didn't think. I just grabbed her." He described the struggle in blunt detail. She screamed, fought back, and in the chaos, he struck her. They fell into the mud, leaving the tangled shoe prints investigators had documented that night. Her jeans tore in the scuffle, leaving the scrap of fabric that carried his blood from a cut on his hand. "I panicked," he said. "I didn't plan it. It just happened." Detectives pressed him on what he did next. His voice stayed calm, almost detached. He admitted dragging her toward the riverbank, terrified the sound would draw attention. When she resisted again, he wrapped his hands around her throat. "She went quiet," he muttered. "After that, I didn't know what to do." He said he left her by the water's edge, the current already swelling from recent rain. The river would take her, he said flatly, offering no remorse, only resignation. The room went silent. Detectives, hardened by years in homicide, later admitted the coldness of his tone unsettled them. It wasn't a burst of guilt or tears. It was indifference. A man speaking as though recalling a chore. Investigators compared his account with the evidence, and the pieces aligned. The car door left ajar, the keys in the ignition, the chaotic footprints, the torn fabric, the trail ending at the river's edge. Details he gave, the angle of the torn jeans, the way the fabric had snagged in the mud, matched facts never released to the public. Only the killer could have known them. When asked if he had ever felt remorse, Raines shrugged. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I tried not to think about it." The statement enraged detectives. One leaned forward and told him, "For her parents, it was yesterday. Every single day for 13 years was yesterday." Word of his confession reached the family later that night. Detectives met them in their home, faces heavy. Her mother listened, hands trembling as she gripped the arm of her chair. "She just said no," she whispered. "That's all it took." Her father's jaw tightened, silent tears running down his face. He had imagined hundreds of scenarios, but the reality that his daughter had died for rejecting a stranger's approach was more brutal than he had ever prepared for. When the confession became public, Salem was shaken to its core. Residents had once believed her disappearance was a mystery beyond comprehension. To learn it had been the impulsive violence of a man who lived blocks away, a man who had even joined the original search efforts, felt like betrayal layered on betrayal. Neighbors recalled seeing him at vigils, nodding solemnly, even offering condolences to her family. "He stood with us," one woman said bitterly on the evening news. All the while, he knew. The revelation split the community. Some were relieved to finally have answers. Others were horrified at how ordinary the motive was. Rejection, anger, and a loss of control. "The scariest part," one college student said, "is it could have been any of us. She did nothing wrong. She just told him no. For investigators, the confession was both victory and burden. They had solved the case, but it had come 13 years too late. Justice delayed is still justice, the police chief told reporters, but no family should have to wait this long. As Raines sat in his cell awaiting trial, Salem wrestled with the haunting truth. The girl who once walked to the park with seashells in her bag had lost her life not to a grand scheme or hidden conspiracy, but to the rage of a man unable to handle rejection. A man who lived quietly among them for more than a decade, blending into the fabric of their community. The silence that had hung over Salem for 13 years had finally been broken. But in its place came a chilling clarity. Sometimes the answers are worse than the unknown. By the spring of 2024, the case of State of Oregon versus Michael Raines had become a fixture on local news. Each update was followed closely, not just by Salem residents, but by people across the state who remembered the headlines from 2010. The courthouse in Marion County prepared for one of the most anticipated trials in its history. Families of other missing loved ones sat in the gallery too, hoping the system could still deliver when time had tried to erase the evidence. On the first day of trial, the courtroom was packed wall to wall. Reporters filled every corner, microphones and cameras waiting for quotes. At the front, her parents sat hand in hand, their faces marked by years of grief but carrying a quiet strength. They had waited nearly 14 years for this moment. The prosecution opened with photographs: the silver car, the torn fabric, the muddy shoe prints. Then came the genealogy profile, the soda straw DNA, and finally, Raines' recorded confession. The prosecutor played the tape, his flat voice filling the courtroom. She said no. I grabbed her. She went quiet. A hush fell over the gallery, the words landing like stone on every ear. Her mother wept openly. Her father pressed a hand over hers, his jaw clenched. Witnesses followed one after another. Crime scene technicians testified how the bloodied scrap of jeans had been preserved for over a decade, waiting for technology to catch up. Genetic genealogists explained how a distant cousin's DNA had led to Raines. Former detectives described their frustration at hitting dead ends in 2010, their relief at seeing the case revived. And then came the community voices. A neighbor recalled seeing Raines at the original vigils, flashlight in hand, standing beside the grieving family. I thought he was one of us, she said through tears, but he was standing there knowing he had done it. The defense struggled from the start. They argued the confession had been coerced, that after hours in a small room, anyone might crack. They pointed out that no body had ever been recovered, leaving gaps about cause of death. But the prosecution countered with details only the killer could have known: the position of the torn jeans, the placement of the keys in the ignition, the drag marks by the riverbank. These facts were never released publicly, the prosecutor told the jury. Only one man could describe them, the man who left them. Throughout it all, Raines sat motionless. He avoided eye contact with the jury, with the parents, with anyone. He showed no remorse, no flicker of regret. When asked by the judge if he wished to speak, he shook his head once. The silence was louder than words. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. Hours stretched into a day, then 2. On the third afternoon, the courtroom filled again as the verdict was read. The foreperson stood, voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Raines, guilty of first-degree murder. Her mother collapsed against her husband's shoulder, sobbing. Her father bowed his head, tears streaming silently. The gallery erupted in muffled gasps and quiet cries. Some embraced, others simply sat in stunned silence. After 13 years of uncertainty, the question had been answered. Sentencing followed weeks later. The courtroom was just as crowded, the air just as heavy. The judge read from the bench, his voice deliberate. The defendant's actions were barbaric, senseless, and robbed a young woman of her life, her family of their joy, and this community of its trust. Justice has been delayed, but today it will not be denied. Michael Raines, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words echoed across the chamber. Some cried, others exhaled as if releasing a breath they'd been holding for more than a decade. Her parents held hands tightly, relief etched alongside grief. For them, justice did not heal the wound, but it finally acknowledged it. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Headlines blared, "Cold Case Justice, Raines sentenced to life." TV broadcasts replayed her smiling photo from 2010 beside images of Raines in handcuffs. Salem residents gathered on the courthouse steps, some holding candles, others carrying signs with her name. One student from her university stood with a handmade poster. "She will never be forgotten." For the community, the trial marked both closure and reckoning. Relief that the case was solved, outrage that it had taken 13 years, and sorrow that her life had ended over a stranger's anger. "It's not joy we feel," one neighbor said. "It's peace, and even that comes with a bitter edge." For her parents, the verdict was the end of one journey and the start of another. They left the courthouse hand in hand, faces wet with tears, greeted by embraces from strangers who had followed their story for years. In a quiet voice to reporters, her father said, "We promised we would not stop until justice came. Today, that promise is kept." But even as Salem exhaled, a lesson lingered. Justice delayed is justice diminished, and her story was a reminder of how fragile truth can be when buried by time. The trial was over, but her memory would continue to echo. In the courthouse, in the classroom she once sat in, and in every parent who whispered her name as a warning to their children. When the trial ended and Michael Raines was sent away to serve life without parole, Salem felt as if it could finally breathe again. But for her family, the absence didn't vanish with the verdict. The chair at the dinner table was still empty. The porch light still burned every night, and her laughter never returned to the house. Justice had been delivered, but peace was something different. Still, from that darkness, the community began to build something lasting. In the fall of 2024, the University of Oregon announced the creation of the Victim's Name Memorial Scholarship for biology students pursuing environmental or conservation studies. The scholarship was launched in the same lecture hall where she had once sat taking notes, dreaming of a career protecting the natural world. Her parents attended the ceremony, sitting in the front row as a plaque was unveiled bearing her name. Her mother wept openly. Her father bowed his head, and the students in attendance stood in a long silence of respect. "She dreamed of working to protect life," her father said softly. "Now, her dream will help others live theirs." The scholarship quickly became one of the most sought after in the program. Each year, when a new student received it, her name echoed again across the campus, ensuring she was never forgotten. Her story wasn't just tragedy anymore. It was fuel for others to pursue the future she never had. Beyond the university, her case reshaped Oregon's approach to unsolved crimes. At seminars and law enforcement conferences, the Marion County District Attorney's Office used her case as a teaching example. Officers spoke of the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how small, because technology that doesn't exist today might solve tomorrow's case. That scrap of fabric was almost dismissed, one detective told a group of trainees, but it ended up being the thread that unraveled the whole story. The Oregon Department of Justice issued a report in 2025 calling her case a watershed moment for the use of forensic genealogy. The report recommended every cold case with biological evidence be retested under new standards. Across the state, dozens of families who had lived in silence saw their cases reopened, some even solved. Her name appeared in those stories too, a symbol that persistence and science could bring long-delayed justice. In Salem, The community created a small memorial at Wallace Marine Park. A stone marker was placed near the lot where her car had been found. It bore her name and the words, "Justice may be delayed, but it will not fade." Residents left flowers and candles there every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. What had once been a place of dread slowly became a place of remembrance. For her parents, life never returned to what it had been. But they carried her memory forward. Her mother, despite her frail health, began speaking at victim advocacy events, urging other families never to give up. Her father worked with local nonprofits to expand funding for cold case units, hoping to spare others the years of silence his family endured. "If our fight can shorten another family's," he said at one event, "then her story means more than just our loss." The case also left its mark on Salem itself. Parents told her story to their children as both warning and lesson. Students at the university grew up knowing her name as part of their campus history, and for those who had lived through the years of fear, the solved case was a reminder that evil can hide in ordinary places. A neighbor's face, a co-worker's nod, and that vigilance was the price of peace. On the 15th anniversary in 2025, hundreds gathered at the park for a vigil. It was the largest since the first days after her disappearance. Candles flickered in the autumn air, casting light across faces both old and young. Some had been classmates who remembered her laugh. Others were strangers who had only learned her story after the trial. Her parents stood quietly at the front, holding hands as her name was read aloud. For the first time in years, the vigil didn't feel like a question hanging in the night. It felt like an answer. The legacy of her case stretched beyond Salem, beyond Oregon. National news outlets highlighted the role of forensic genealogy, placing her story alongside others that had changed the way America thought about cold cases. At conferences, detectives from other states spoke her name when explaining why they had revisited files once considered unsolvable. She had become a symbol of persistence, a reminder that silence isn't the end. It's just a pause until the truth can be found. For her parents, the grief remained, but so did pride. They had fought for answers, endured years of doubt, and finally seen justice. In one of their last interviews together, her mother said, "We'll never get her back. But her story changed something bigger than us. That's the only way we can live with this." Her father, sitting beside her, added, "She deserved the truth, and she got it. That's all we ever wanted." As the candles at Wallace Marine Park burned down that night, Salem stood a little lighter. Not healed. Wounds like this never fully close, but steadier, carrying her name into the future. Her story was no longer just about what was taken, but about what was built after. Justice, change, and a legacy that outlived the silence.